Hi, welcome to Prophecy in the News. I'm your host, Doug Woodward. Today I'm excited and pleased to have in the studio writer and speaker and researcher Troy Anderson. Welcome, Troy. It's great to have you.
It's a great honor to be on your show.
You and I have known one another. We've been sort of email pen pals for like about 8 years, I think we talked about, and but we've never met face to face. So this is fun because we've done interviews on the phone and we've communicated a lot, talked about the issue of Bible prophecy, and so it's great to finally get a chance to meet you in person. So I'm really excited in particular about this. So,
Yeah, it's great to meet you in person also.
thank you. So I think what I'd like to do is folks are our audience, I would think, is familiar with your name. They probably don't know much about your background other than they know you're a good writer, which you are, which is why one of the reasons why these books are so great. But tell us, if you would, just a little bit about your writing background. How did you get into that? You've done some really interesting things. Have had some impressive positions. So talk for a minute or so, if you would, about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for 26 years. I was a reporter at the Los Angeles Daily News for many years. I was an executive editor for Charisma magazine. I write for Reuters and Newsmax and
Hmm.
different publications. And my whole writing career began probably when I was about 9 years old. My grandmother encouraged me to follow one of my ancestors' footsteps. He's Friedrich von Schiller.
Right.
He's the German poet and
Schiller.
playwright. Yep.
Right.
He wrote Ode to Joy that Beethoven set to music in the Ninth Symphony.
Right. And it kind of borrowed it into the ninth century
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a great theme or tune,
Uh-huh.
basically. Right.
And then he wrote, a number of plays, Marie Stuart and William Tell and Don Carlos, which is the inspiration for George Lucas's Star Wars.
Yeah.
And so my grandma just, she always would talk about Schiller and encouraged me to become a writer, and
Right.
so I eventually did.
So you're sort of channeling an ancestor a little bit in your
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
Not literally. We don't believe in channeling,
Right.
but yeah, but metaphorically,
Yeah.
that's the case. So you and Paul McGuire have written these two books, Trumpocalypse, which we're going to talk about today, and The Babylon Code, which has been out now for a year and a half or so, I think it is. Um, how did you two of you connect? How did you guys get to know one another? Why did you decide to become co-authors, I guess?
I was a reporter at the Los Angeles Daily News back in 2009, and I'd heard about this prophecy conference at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills.
Yes.
And I went to this, and Jack Hibbs was there, Tim LaHaye, and Paul McGuire. And I heard Paul McGuire say, "The world is undergoing the most dramatic transformation since the Tower of Babel, a coming one world government, cashless society, and universal religion." And so it struck me that if this is true, this is a gigantic story. I've been an investigative journalist for many years, and so I introduced myself to Paul afterwards, and he gave me a copy of his book, The Day the Dollar Died,
Mm.
and that just began our friendship and this whole journey of investigating. Are we really in the run up to these end time events that the Bible talks about?
Right. And one of the things that we're going to get into some really interesting things here in our discussion, a section of the book. But let's talk first about the fear that seems to be really dominating the antagonists, the opponents to Donald Trump. You talk a bit about the nuclear football, which is that briefcase that there's always an officer that hangs around with the president. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the worry that that those have, that when we say Trumpocalypse, that they fear that Donald Trump is actually going to push the button and he's going to be this sort of mad bomber and start nuclear war and all that. Tell us a little bit about the thinking that you and Paul have related to that sort of whole mad bomber kind of point of view of Donald Trump.
Yeah, so shortly before the election, and then even after the election, there was all kinds of headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the Trumpocalypse, and so it was this meme that was sort of spreading through the media, and it essentially means that there's concerns that if he was elected, that he would trigger the apocalypse.
Right.
And so we after President Trump was elected, Paul called me, and he was very passionate, and he said, God has given us a spiritual nuclear weapon with Trump's election here, and he felt that God had raised up President Trump because it was everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and then
Right,
then
including
President
Donald Trump,
right,
probably.
and so it sent shock waves around the world, and
Right.
so we did a call with our literary agent, and we're talking about writing a sequel to the Babylon Code, which is an expose of globalism,
Hmm.
and President Trump had campaigned on Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo,
Right.
and so
Of course, I'll insert just the fact that he's used the term nationalism, which has a connotation of Adolf Hitler. That was German nationalism, and that nationalism is an evil, and so forth. But clearly, that's not what Trump was expressing when he talked about nationalism in contrast to globalism. You might talk just for a second about that. If you would.
Yeah, so I mean, nationalism is the idea that God has set up independent nation states throughout the world. This all began at the Tower of Babel. Hence, one of the reasons why we call the first book the Babylon Code. God's plan for humanity was to have independent nation states, just like we have different branches of government, independent
The
nations.
separation of
Yeah,
powers, right?
checks and balances. You don't want to
Right.
consolidate one, power in one individual, because then
Right.
you end up with a gigantic, nightmare
Get everybody into
dictatorship.
one tower, and it's going to create a lot of trouble.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, so the nation state is part of God's plan for humanity,
Mhm.
and until the coming millennial kingdom. But so President Trump, we felt that he was raised up by God, and the Bible
Mhm.
talks about that God deposes leaders and he raises up others. So
That's
in this
right.
sense, all leaders are part of
Or
God's
actually,
sort of plan.
yes, from a providential standpoint. I had a Jewish rabbi friend that reminded me that the words coincidence and accident are not in the Old Testament. So, and that's a long story, of course, in and of itself. You kind of mentioned a little bit, it's sort of what I would call kind of some of the mystical qualities of what's happened with Donald Trump, his arrival on the scene. There was you reference, excuse me, a television show from one of that great bastion of truth, the History Channel, which I say tongue-in-cheek, of course. It was called Nostradamus, Election 2016. And you talk quite a bit in this one section of the book about Nostradamus, and of course to evangelicals, it's kind of a controversial figure. You might talk for a second a little bit about, I call him Dr. No, but Dr. Nostradamus, who was a doctor. Tell us a little bit of the history there, and why did that become interesting to you, and what was it that was being said about Nostradamus and Donald Trump in the 2016 election?
Yeah, so prior to the election, there was all kinds of stories in various media outlets that did Nostradamus predict the rise of President Trump,
Right.
and if he's elected, would he bring about the end of the world?
Right.
And like you said, the History Channel had a special on this, and so I interviewed John Hogue,
Mhm.
who's considered the world's predominant Nostradamus expert.
Yes.
He's been on like 150 History Channel, Discovery
Right.
Channel.
I've read a couple of his books back when I was writing a book about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah.
So you've seen him for decades on
Right.
TV and stuff, and
Right.
so I interviewed him for this because it's part of the story. It's part of this Trumpocalypse idea, and of course Nostradamus, his grandfather, as I recall, taught him the Bible when he was young, but they also taught him occult stuff, and so he's sort of this mixture. He was a Christianized Jew,
Yes.
but he used occult methods to forecast the future.
Right.
And people think, maybe he predicted some things, but many things, probably
Well,
not.
he to make a point in his favor, he lost his entire family to the plague, but he traveled throughout the countryside of France, doing what he could to alleviate pain and suffering of those that were also experiencing the plague. So he was genuinely a doctor, and he was compassionate. But he did this bad thing with, looking in the water at
Right.
night and reflections and so forth, and then prophesying the future. Explain why his prophecies are kind of hard to plumb, why they're difficult to read, if you would.
Yeah, so his prophecies, use all kinds of anagrams and occult references, and they mix some of the Bible in there, and then Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah. So it's sort of this amalgamation, and then his forecasting methods, and so you can almost read anything you want into many of his prophecies.
Yes, there's some that seem pretty obvious, Some of the prophecies that appeared, that Napoleon appears in, those seem to be pretty straightforward. The Corsica reference and all that. So, but others are pretty, hard to necessarily prove, I guess.
Yeah. He talked about Napoleon and Hister, which many people believe was Hitler. And so, when I interviewed John Hogue, he said that he believed that Nostradamus had predicted the rise of what he called the first Antichrist, which was Napoleon, the second Antichrist, Hitler, and he believes that there'll be a third Antichrist, which will, maybe this will be
Which he
the
calls
final.
Mabus,
Yeah, Mabus.
Mabus,
Right.
which was, people have speculated is an anagram for Obama, for Bush, for different people, Saddam Hussein, and so forth.
And the most interesting thing is that John Hogue tried to use that anagram to see if Trump fit that, but
Right.
Trump definitely did not fit it.
Did not fit
so
that.
that was one of the most surprising things, is that there's been all this talk, could Trump be the Antichrist? But John Hogue says no, he's
Right.
he's not part of the club.
He's not one of those candidates, from what he can see. Let's talk about another sort of prophetic book that that is probably more analytic than attempting to be really prophetic, but it's known as the Fourth Turning. And the now disenfranchised Steve Bannon, who was one of Trump's key strategy leaders, was a strong believer in the Fourth Turning. And the Fourth Turning tends to coincide perhaps with this notion of Trump and the apocalypse. You might explain a little bit about the Fourth Turning, sort of as a popular book, and what about it is suggesting that we may be facing the apocalypse relatively soon.
Yeah, so the Fourth Turning is a book that analyzes some key historical periods in American history, beginning with the Revolutionary War, and then also involving the Civil War, World War II, and then what's called the Fourth Turning, which the authors argue is occurring between roughly 2005 and I think it was 2025. So we're sort of in the ballpark.
In that time frame.
And it began with some of the financial crises we had about a decade ago. And now the question is, are we in the middle of this sort of final phase of this? Could there be some great war, or cataclysm, or some kind of major upheaval of society?
Right. And it's interesting that John Hogue, I think, maybe expressed sort of a Republican point of view when he said that if HRC, Hillary Clinton, had been elected, that we probably would be in World War III already by 2017. But I don't know if he actually expressed his political point of view, but he certainly was fearful that the election of Hillary might be a real bad thing.
His interpretation of Nostradamus' prophecies is he believes that Nostradamus predicted there would be a third world war, after. It was complicated, and we explored all in the book. But he believed that the beginning of the new Cold War with Russia in 2014 is the beginning of this period of time in which we could have some kind of terrible cataclysm here on Earth. And I think he talks about if Clinton had been elected, he thought maybe that might happen by end of 2017. But since she wasn't, then he's looking at possibly sometime between now and 2027. Of course, we're dealing with Nostradamus and
exactly.
occult stuff,
Yeah, I was going to say that a lot of us that were following the election closely and have been students of Bible prophecy and geopolitics, which is kind of an area that I sort of focus on. A lot of us had sort of that similar sense of foreboding of what might happen if another globalist was elected again and took office again. So and Trump clearly represents an alternative to that. So let me talk a bit about how you can get a copy of Trumpocalypse, which I have to make sure I always say it correctly. It's such a mouthful. Trumpocalypse, the End Times President, a battle against the globalist elite, and the countdown to Armageddon. It is a terrific book. I have read almost all of it, and some of it several times, and I strongly recommend that you get a copy of this book. Extremely well written. This guy is a great writer, and of course Paul McGuire is so knowledgeable, and the two of them really blend their talents together. They did that also in the preceding book, which is really, there are two parts. There's probably going to be more coming in this series. The Babylon Code, which many of you I know have read, as I have. I in fact interviewed Paul about 18 months or so ago on the Babylon Code. So this book, Trumpocalypse, is available from Prophecy in the News for $24.95 plus shipping and handling. And then this book, The Babylon Code, is available for $23.95. And the two of them together are bundled in a package for $43.95. I believe that's right. $44.95, excuse me. So the two of these together for $44.95. They're hardbound books, very beautiful, well structured, well put together. So I recommend it heartily, and they're available again from Prophecy in the News. So I encourage you to call the number on your screen or to use the internet store, the web store, and order these books. They're in stock and available, and we'd encourage you to do that right away. So let's get back to some of these, again, sort of mystical qualities that kind of coincide with the arrival of Donald Trump. I found this particularly interesting. I'm going to quote this. This was, you said, quote, "A few weeks ago, I was reading a piece on President Trump's inner circle," wrote Eric Sapp of the Democratic consulting firm, the Ellison Group, I think is how it's pronounced. And so this is Eric speaking. You're writing about this. Quote, "The story talked about how Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, saved the family fortune by selling their real estate holdings and investing them all in a single building, 666 Fifth Avenue, and how he then leveraged the profits from 666 Fifth Avenue to buy a new property adjoining the family's $666 million development in New Jersey. Want to guess how high the new building being built from the profits of 666 Fifth Avenue will be? Yep, 666 feet. What are your thoughts on that? Obviously, it struck you, and so you included it in this section of the book.
Well, I mean, it's quite curious if all these 666 coincidences, with this. But I interviewed Jerry Jenkins,
Right.
for this book, and actually I interviewed Tim LaHaye before he passed away here a couple of years ago. And what Jerry told me is that about half the mail they've gotten over the decades is somebody saying this president is the
Yeah.
Antichrist or this president is the
We
Antichrist.
call it pin the tail on the Antichrist,
Right.
Yeah.
And it all depends on your political persuasion. So he
Yep.
said, and then I think his quote was, if half the country doesn't
Yeah.
like you, then you're probably not
How
the candidate.
how could you be the Antichrist?
Right.
Because the Bible
So-
says everyone will love you.
Right.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, then you had a quote in here also from Gabriel Campanario, who wrote in the Seattle Times, where I lived there for about 21 years. Quote, "Trump's ideas meld perfectly with evangelical apocalyptic expectations as the Battle of Armageddon nears. He promises to seize power and use it for them. He claims he would restore religious liberty to evangelicals. He would defend Israel at all costs. He would fight abortion by adding conservative judges to the Supreme Court. After listing several other Trump policies dear to evangelicals, Campanario concludes, quote, "If Armageddon is coming, and many evangelicals believe it is, there can be no one better to lead the United States than Donald Trump." Does that suggest that Trump is the trigger to Armageddon, that he will bring it about? Or what do you make of his statement that because Trump's mannerisms tend to coincide with what evangelicals believe is the right thing to do, if I should say it that way? What do you make of that?
Well, what's interesting about the rise of President Trump at this time is, almost every Bible scholar I've interviewed for both of these books, like over 150 different experts, from Bible scholars, faith leaders, even experts in geopolitics, economics, science, theology, intelligence, military affairs. I mean, the overwhelming consensus among the Bible scholars and faith leaders is that we are in the run-up to these end-time events the Bible predicts. But then all these secular experts believe we're in the run-up to the end of human civilization,
Right.
and climate change, nuclear war. And so, I mean, he comes to power at probably one of the most prophetic, significant times in history. And so the question is, and I asked this of most of the experts, including you when I interviewed you,
Yeah.
and many others, is why is he president at this very
juncture,
this
at this point in
juncture,
time, right?
and that's the big question.
Yeah, it really is. It's one of the things that struck me interesting is I'd heard a little bit about this, but you all covered this pretty well in this section of the book, was the fact that there have been quite a few rabbis that in Israel that have talked about Trump as a messianic figure. You might convey a little bit of what that's all about.
Yeah, so there's all these rabbis in Israel that believe that that he may be like some kind of forerunner
Mm-hmm.
of the Messiah for the Jewish people,
Right.
and and so there's all kinds of talk about what role he might play. I interviewed Tom Horn, and he referred to him as, the rabbis saying he's sort of like the John the Baptist heralding the
Right.
coming of this figure. So
Right.
it's quite intriguing that all these rabbis are now talking about his role in prophecy.
I think there's even one there's this connection also with the Bible code that we know a lot about and heard a lot about. That there may be some fulfillment in that respect. Um, let's see. This was another thing I'll mention here. Bible code experts Joe Gallus and Robert Wolf found that Trump's name using biblical numerology equals 424, which is gematria for Messiah for the house of David. Breaking Israel News feature writer Adam Elihu, I guess, Berkowitz wrote, quote, "This is not to say that Donald Trump is the Messiah, but that his presidency will usher in the Messianic era." So that, this sort of, I guess that all builds as part of the story of this book, that there are lots of reasons to think that we are on the cusp of the second coming, and somehow Donald Trump fits into that scenario. And that's clearly one of the main messages of the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main messages is that, everybody's watching all these events transpire. You just watch the news each day, and, like as we were writing the book, the whole thing with the North Korean,
Right.
nuclear threat emerged after, sort of
Yes.
after we sort of began the process of writing the book. Then President Trump declared Jerusalem the eternal capital of Israel. We have a chapter in there that delves into that whole topic, and it's just,
Absolutely. It is uncanny. This was also really interesting that you pointed out that there was this was one of the 72, not sure. There's of course been a lot of discussion about whether the Antichrist will in fact be from the tribe of Dan. Will the Antichrist be Hebrew? Will the Antichrist be Gentile? So there's different points of view. Quite a few, in fact, J.R. Church had written in terms of the prophecy of Daniel, that it was very likely that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan, would be a descendant of the Greeks, of the Romans, and somehow of the Hebrews. And so he wrote about that, which is a great book. If you, all the viewers, have not read that, I encourage you to get a copy of that as well. But there's a discussion here about the connection with North Korea, which you kind of go, well, how would there be a connection with the whole story of the coming of the Messiah and North Korea? But there's an interesting connection between Sheol in Deuteronomy 32:22 and the capital of South Korea. You might mention that as well.
Yeah, I forget the rabbi's name, but
Yeah, it's a strange one. Levi Saadia Nakamani, I think.
yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
so he came. I mean, he was like a very predominant rabbi
Yes.
in Israel.
He had warned
And
about, predicted the 1967 war, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and so he's predicting North Korea is related to the final days. Go ahead.
he came out, many years ago, like 20, 25 years ago, and said that don't worry about Iran, don't worry about all this stuff in the Middle East. North Korea is going to be the trigger that's going to cause all the chaos. And at the time, other rabbis thought maybe he's getting a little too old. But now,
Yeah.
like when I interviewed Adam Berkowitz, he said, everybody's like going, my oh my, this predominant rabbi talked about this 25 years ago, and now it's all unfolding. So what? And then, of course, we know that North Korea and Iran work closely together, and Russia and China perhaps been helping with their nuclear programs. So, we're living in very dangerous times.
Well, we are. There's you don't mention this, but I'll mention it. It's curious that there are only 3 nations in the world that don't have or not members, in effect, of the central banks. And those 3 nations are Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Every other nation is associated with central banks, and so that kind of feeds into the whole issue of the conspiracy of the central bankers and the international bankers and the globalists and so forth.
That is very curious.
Yeah, it's very curious. You talk about the Zadikims, the 72 righteous ones that supposedly received the Shekinah, or the divine presence, and which is a central text of the rabbinic Judaism. Another rabbi here was Rabbi Berger said, you have to get the word out now. North Korea is the big one. Adam Berkowitz, as you were saying, of Breaking Israel News. Quote, this 100-year-old righteous man, Azadikim, sent an emissary to Rabbi Berger saying, in the end of days there is going to be horrible violence, but the sign that the Messiah is truly imminent is when a war breaks out in the northern part of the world involving all the nations of the world, and he said it is very close to happening. Wow. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so these rabbis are very concerned about the North Korea and this whole standoff we have between America and North Korea now, and then also that there's these there's many prophecies in the Bible, especially in Revelation, as you well detailed in your book, The Final
Yes.
Babylon,
Right.
excellent book,
Thank you.
and other books you've written that are talk about a possible nuclear war that
Yes.
that could erupt someday, and so
And
we
unfortunately
explore all
could
this.
involve America.
Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, there's quite a number of different references, but they all kind of tie back to that you mentioned here, which is why I found it fascinating that you relate back to a number of these Jewish rabbis that reference the end of days, Donald Trump, the North Korean crisis. So we have we have about a minute. Let's just introduce, and we'll have another show before too long, and we'll talk about this more. But there's a guy named Peter Vincent Pry that was the head of the commission on the EMP. You might just mention what that's about, and this is another area that you talk about in the book. You only got about 40 seconds, so just to hit a quick summation, if you would.
Yeah, so we have a chapter called Super EMP Threat and Daughter of Babylon.
Right.
And I interviewed Peter Vincent Pry, a former CIA analyst, head of the EMP Commission. And he and former CIA Director James Woolsey are very concerned about EMP weapons that North Korea apparently has.
Electromagnetic pulse.
Right.
That a nuclear blast creates that, basically zaps everything electrical, which in our society is just about everything. Knocks it out.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, they consider this the greatest threat to our society is that,
Right.
detonating one of these weapons in satellites above us, which, apparently they're trying to launch or have already
Right.
launched,
Yeah.
could take out our electric grid.
Yes.
And the estimates are terrible that, perhaps it could kill, 9 in 10 Americans
Yeah.
over a period of years.
Not so much the EMP, but the fact that everything's electrical and our society could crumble. We are flat out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this program. Encourage you to purchase the book. Thank you, Troy, and thank you for viewing. Keep looking up.